So the tithe is 10%, and the tithe, finally, so at least we look at scriptures briefly. The tithe is something that is biblical in the sense that it occurs in scripture. There are different ways of using the word biblical. I'm saying the tithe occurs in scriptures. It occurs in scriptures both in descriptive and prescriptive formats. So there are descriptive aspects to tithing in the New Testament, and there are prescriptive aspects to tithing in the New Testament. That is to say, there are instances of tithe in the Bible. I mean to say, not just in the New Testament, in the Bible. There are instances of tithing in scriptures that are just instances of narrative, where they are telling us what happened. It's a story. There are storylines to say, oh, this was what happened. And part of what happened was that somebody gave tithe as part of what happened. That's descriptive. There are instances of tithing in the Bible that are prescriptive. That means they are commanded. They are prescribed. Those are passages in scriptures where tithing is prescribed. The big point is, we will need to look at descriptive, prescriptive, and then New Testament. That's how we're going to do it. We look at descriptive, prescriptive, and New Testament. Because the subject of tithe is a subject that is mentioned in the New Testament, but it is mentioned generally it is mentioned anecdotally or marginally. All right? What does it mean that it is anecdotal or it is marginal? It is marginal means that, okay, let's even say that it is mentioned, even if you like, you can say it was mentioned incidentally, to say that there were things that were in focus, and in discussing those things, tithing was part of the discussion, even though the heart of the discussion was not a teaching on tithing. So we need to have a special category for looking at tithe in the New Testament. But even though that is what we have advertised, it's important for you to understand that tithing did not begin in the New Testament, and tithing did not begin under the law of Moses. The first major incident of tithing was in Genesis chapter 14. That was long before Moses was born. And if you look at Genesis chapter 14, which I think we should look at now, and this is the war of the kings. All right? So, by the time Abraham's nephew, Lot, was taken with Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham heard of it, he divided himself in verse 15, and he went after them and smote them, and then eventually he brought again his brother and his good, and the women also, and the people. Now, when the king of Sodom went to meet with him on his return, the Bible said Melchizedek, verse 18, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which had delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Hello? If God gives me the liberty, I will be teaching some very uncomfortable things from that verse of scripture. Because Abraham, they think that Abraham gave tithe from, they were not his own. Hello? Hello? Yes, it was the lot of the nations that when they went to war, and they conquered the previous conquerors. They took spoil. Those spoil included the properties of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of that they are taking, that he was now bringing back to give back to the king of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other confederate kings. Eventually, the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, the kings, even told Abraham, just give us our people. You can take all the loot. Abraham said, no. Take your things, because let it not be said in the future that you made me rich. Right? It was that loot, that bounty that Abraham gave tithe. He gave him tithes of all. Now, at this first instance of the tithe, it's also important to note the preposition that Abraham did not pay him tithe. He gave him tithe. In the descriptive passages, I want you to notice the kind of language that is used. So, this is Abraham and Melchizedek. At this time, the law of Moses was far from being in effect. Genesis chapter 28. So, let's read from verse 17 so you can understand the context. And he was afraid and said, how dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So you can tell that this is who? Jacob. That his dream when he saw the ladder. All right. And he was running away from home because of the incident between him and Esau, when he had taken the blessing and all of that. And Esau said, when our dad dies, I'm going to kill my brother. The mom heard and told him, just run first. When your brother's anger cools down, I will call you to come back. This was that escape from home, to go to the mom's people. That Jacob slept somewhere and had this dream and all of that. Now, verse 18, and Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for his pillows and set it up for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in his way, that I go and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. Where did we stop our reading? Verse 20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. Again, this is descriptive. This is not prescriptive. This is a man before Moses, before the law, saying, God, all the things you will give me on this my journey, I will give 10% of it to you. His grandfather before him, we saw him in chapter 14, giving 10% of the spoil of battle to Melchizedek. Now, that man's grandson is promising the Lord to say, if you bless me, of all the things that you give me in blessing, I will give a 10th unto you. So we had the practice of tithe before we had the law of tithing. There was the practice of the tithing. There was the practice of tithe before the law of tithing. The practice of the tithe predates the tabernacle that was commissioned in Exodus chapter 25. It predates the priesthood that was commissioned by Moses through Aaron, the family of the Levite. It predates the Levitical order. The first person that was given tithe in scripture was Melchizedek. He was not a Jew. He was not a Hebrew, because the Hebrews descended from Abraham. Abraham is called the Hebrew. Abraham the Hebrew. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, the king of peace. Zedek. The king of peace. The king of Salem. It was to him that Abraham gave tithe. He had nothing to do with the Aaronic priesthood. He had nothing to do with the first temple Judaism or second temple Judaism. It had nothing to do with tabernacle worship or temple worship. And it was not a command. We just simply saw it as a practice. And this seemed to be a practice that was a little bit known within this genealogy. Because the man that we saw in Genesis 14 and the man that we are seeing now in Genesis 28, this man that we are seeing in Genesis 28 is not even the direct son of the man. This is a grandson. So there was Abraham and there was Isaac before Jacob. And somehow, the consciousness of this self-imposed obligation is self-imposed. Because there is no instruction from the Lord to these people. That's it. Bring your tithe. Give me a tithe. No. The first man was not even giving it directly as it were to the Lord. And when Jacob said he will give him the tithe, you even want to ask yourself, how did Jacob intend to send that tithe to God? Because one of the Tuesdays I'm going to be teaching and the topic will be giving to God. Giving to God. Because there are people out there now that are trying to make us to feel bad when we say people should give to God. Because they believe that there's nothing you give that actually goes to God. Is it not church? Is pastor? Is church? Is pastor? I will teach you from scripture that there's such a thing as giving to God. So when Jacob was promising to give God the tithe, you need to ask, how was he hoping to send it to God? And he was making that promise outside of a commandment, outside of a prescription. So we only know it because it was described for us in scripture. So there might be prescriptions to tithing, but there are descriptions of tithing that predate the first prescription in the records of scripture. What this might imply, therefore, is that even if the prescriptive obligations to tithing are out of the equation, do they completely obliterate the descriptive pronouncement of scripture about the tithe? Because if the law of Moses never happened, people still gave tithe. So if the law of Moses no more happens, why should the tithing conversation be based entirely on the law as if it began with the law? To say we are no more under the law. Yes, we are no more under the law. The tithing was required under the law. Yes, but the tithing was practiced before the law. So who says it can no longer be practiced after the law? You may say that the tithing is not required, and I will agree with you. Are you with me? But it does not mean that the tithing is unnecessary for the point that I made before. So we're going to go into Leviticus later on, chapter 30, chapter 31. You're going to see the prescriptions of the tithe, where God is prescribing that people should bring a tithe, and he goes on to list what it should be used for under the Aaronic arrangement. Is that okay? So that you will see the prescript. Oh boy. I'm out of time. Okay, Leviticus 27 verse 30. Quickly. This is now a command. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add thereunto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passes under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. He shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And if he change it at all, then both it and the change thereof shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. So these are prescriptions unto the tithe. You will see the same prescription in chapter 31. And this happened under the Aaronic arrangement. I'm not sure that there might be a lot of use in doing too much of the Mosaic arrangement and tithing, but I will touch on it briefly so that you can have answers, right? Things like money was never mentioned as a requirement in tithing. Tithing was the crops of the field and the head, the crops of the farm and the head of the field. Those were the kinds of things that were tithed. And there are good reasons for it, right? Because of the society in which they lived. And then the tithe also there was the tithe of the tithe. And then the tithing There were even the tithing that was required by the tither to bring before the Lord and consume. Okay? And so people who try to be clever by half, they throw up all of those things to say, why are we not practicing that one anymore? What of the tithe that the person who is supposed to tithe brings before the Lord and he eats it before the Lord so that he can be glad and the Lord will bless him? Those things are there under the Aaronic arrangement, under the Mosaic law. And I would understand if you are appealing to it because the tithing is being taught from that law standpoint. Then you can say, if we are practicing the tithe as a pronouncement under the law, then we should practice it completely as it was instituted under the law. But I'm saying that before the tithe was prescribed, it was described. Before the law came up, the tithe already existed. So somebody can be practicing the tithe because of Moses. Another person can be practicing the tithe because of Abraham. Are you with me? Are you with me? And even though we're in the New Testament, it looks to me like the Bible says that we are children of Abraham. What you find out with Abraham was that nobody required tithe from him. It was not commanded to him. It was not prescribed to him. So we may eventually try to dig into what was it that Abraham was tracking in tithing. The one thing I want you to take away from here is that the bottom line of all of what we are going to be doing is generosity. But I believe that the tithing is like base level in terms of discipline. If you want to develop your generosity muscles, hello, I will recommend the tithe. Because many of you will find that you will become more generous in your giving to God if you made tithe sacrosanct. Because at this moment, people who give tithe, they give more than you give, even though you are forming generosity. Because after giving their tithe, they will still give offering like you give offering. After giving their tithe, they will still contribute to special projects like you contribute to special projects. And if you followed everything I taught at the beginning, you will find out that one of the things the tithe does for you is that it makes sure that your giving does not fall below a certain level of proportionality before the Lord. So that, for instance, even if there is a billionaire who is a tither, there will be a ground upon which you and him can stand as far as generosity is concerned. Huh? Even though in our own books here, he might be a big giver in that regard. You, too, you are a big giver in that regard before the Lord. Because you and him, you are giving equally. Not the same figure, but you are giving equally. He brings 10% to the Lord. You bring 10% to the Lord. That proportion is an important matter that you need to capture. And the tithe, for the New Testament believer, I don't think we need to read the New Testament passages. Jesus talked about it when he's rebuking the Pharisees, and he says, oh, you are very detailed in everything. You give a tithe of the cumin, you pay tithe of your grains, but then you have forgotten the weightier matters of the law. In Matthew 23:23, popular passage of scripture. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. So Jesus is saying you should have embraced the weightier matters of the law, mercy, justice, judgment, and not to have also done what? Ignored the other. And that other is what? The tithe of your mint and anise and cumin. So here, Jesus is making a point, but the point he was making here was not a teaching on the tithe. Do you get my point? And his audience here was the Pharisees. He was talking to the Pharisees who lived under the Mosaic covenant. But this reference to the tithe is in the New Testament. And then you see it, I think, in the Lucan account also, and then eventually in the book of Hebrews. The writer to the Hebrews was making a point and said that Aaron, Levi, all right, whose family received the tithe, was in the loins of Abraham when Abraham gave the tithe unto Melchizedek, so that in a sense, even Levi paid the tithe because Levi was in the loins. And here men that die receive tithe, but here he that receiveth them, of whom it is witness that he liveth. And as I may say, Levi also, who received tithes, paid tithes in Abraham. So you see that it was also anecdotal. The point of the teaching here is not tithe, but the tithing issue came up in order to make a point. So there are New Testament references to the tithe, but you wouldn't find any New Testament prescription for the tithe for New Testament believers. Do you get it? Do you get it? Do you get it? So tithing, particularly as tithe in that regard, is not a core New Testament obligation for New Testament believers, but generosity is a core New Testament obligation for New Testament believers. And the point is that if you are not generous enough to do 10%, if you are struggling with 10%, how are you going to be generous at all? So, if you are saying, I don't want to tithe, I don't have a problem with that. Maybe because you want to do 15%. Maybe because you want to do 20%. And like I've explained, if you are doing 15%, that's not tithe. That's 15%. I'm simply saying that men that did not have the New Testament privileges that you have were required to be able to tithe under the Old Testament. Now we live in the era of grace. You have the heart of flesh, not the heart of stone. All right? Tithing should not be something that we belabor as a church. And because there are excesses in the teachings of tithe, there can also be excesses in reaction. If anybody says, if you don't give your tithe or pay your tithe, you will go to hell, that's not accurate New Testament teaching. But at the same time, if anybody says, therefore, you don't need to bother about what proportion you are giving to the Lord, again, that's not accurate. The same way we teach people to say, you need to set, if you like, set an alarm to make sure that every morning you are able to pray 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And then with time you can improve it to 1 hour. To make sure, Jesus said, could you not watch and pray with me for just 1 hour? And we encourage you to make sure that you are intentional about your communion with the Lord in terms of how much time you are devoting to your communion with the Lord. When we are teaching you generosity, we also will not be out of place to teach you that you need to be intentional about your generosity to the Lord. Set parameters around you. And the tithing is one of such parameters. So it's a useful handle that we have inherited from the fathers before it was even institutionalized in the law. And that is what it serves. And the goal is for you to be able to start from there, but the goal is not for you to camp there, actually. For the New Testament, the tithing is supposed to be to say, bad as a bad. Let me and Old Testament folks be at the same. At least let me start from them. But me, I'm a New Testament believer. I live under a better covenant. I have better promises. I have better provisions. So I can't wait to leave these Old Testament guys behind. That should be the mindset of a believer.